All right. Welcome everyone to the first Alumni Dialogues session of Students for Liberty in partnership with the King's College of London. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists for today, Mr. Alexander Downer, who's the Executive Chair of the International School for Government at King's College London. He is currently the Chairman of the UK think tank Policy Exchange and a trustee of the International Crisis Group. Mr. Downer served as Australia's High Commissioner to the UK from 2014 until 2018. He previously held the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs for Australia from 1996 to 2007. In addition, Mr. Downer spent more than 20 years representing Mayo in the Australian Parliament and served as opposition leader and Australian Liberal Party leader from 1994 to 1995. Our second panelist for today is Mr. Jorge Jraissati, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's the Director of Alumni of Students for Liberty, an international network with over 2,800 freedom activists in 117 countries. Jorge's work is focused on establishing alumni initiatives aimed at advancing liberal democracy and economic development in several countries. Jorge is also an economist, a researcher at the IESE Business School. His work has been presented at universities like Cambridge and Harvard and published at places like Foreign Policy and Oxford University Press. To start off, my name is Magnus Gunnarsson. I come from Iceland and I work for the Center for Social and Economic Research. To start the panel, we're going to do brief introductions on programs here, starting with Mr. Jorge about the alumni programs at Students for Liberty. Mr. Jorge.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you for moderating this panel. Yes, I want to introduce this type of what we call alumni dialogues. And what we want is to bring together alumni from Students for Liberty. We have an alumni network of over 10,000 leaders of liberty in academia, business, politics. And what we want is more exchanges between them and policymakers and academics. So we can all together think about ideas and find ways to bring solutions to the people. So yeah, this is the first panel that we are doing, but we are currently in conversations with some multilateral institutions and universities to do more of these panels. If any of you is interested in partnering for this kind of events, please send me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Mr. Downer?
Yes, well, thanks, Magnus. I'm Alexander Downer. I'm the Executive Chair of the International School for Government at King's College London. And what our School for Government does is basically provide master's level modules, most of which are available online and as individual modules, as distinct from it being necessary for students to take a whole course, a postgraduate certificate or diploma or master's course. They can do individual modules as well. And they are designed to improve the skill set of people working either in or with governments. So they focus on the hard skills of working in government. How do you make policy? How do you assess policy? How do you implement policy? They focus on essential knowledge, such as data analytics. Given the era we live in, data is crucially important for understanding the world that we live in and evaluating policies. Through to soft skills like what we're doing now, how to communicate with people, how to deal with social media, how to deal with the normal media, the public media, and finally how to deal with the public themselves. You know, how to respond to people who don't agree with you. Do you just shout them down? Do you just conclude that they're all stupid? Or do you try to understand why people think what they think and try to explore those issues? So coming out of our School for Government, we have more than 1,000 British civil servants who have done our modules. We have civil servants and government people, as well as corporates from many other parts of the world, most recently including corporates from Norway, Denmark, Sweden and Finland. So you know, we're pretty diverse in terms of our student body. But that's what the School for Government does, and King's College London is one of the world's top 30 universities.
Thank you, Mr. Downer. Going into the start of the panel, I would like to invite Mr. Jorge to start with his thesis or his opinions on the foreign policy of authoritarian states. Mr. Jorge.
Thank you very much. Yes. Basically, my premise is simple, in the sense that what is going on in Ukraine and the invasion of Russia in Ukraine this year, I think is a turning point for our generation. I think it's the beginning of a new paradigm, of a new time, in which I think that we are all realizing that authoritarians are on the march. That the same way that, for example, our parents' generation had the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that moment was a force for good. Right now, we are seeing just the opposite, that the times are changing, that this naive idealism that all people had in the 1990s is gone, and that democracy is not automatic, it's not the end of history. And I think this politics of inevitability is a problem. And I think what is going on in Ukraine is just a wake-up call for everybody in the West. And one of the things that we are seeing in this authoritarian march is that they're creating what I call an authoritarian alliance. They are creating their own network, so they can spread their ideology, so they can spread their power, which is also their way that they maintain power and their grip on power domestically. And I think we are seeing this, and I realized that when I was in Venezuela, but we are seeing this in many areas. One of them is, of course, the economic area, in which, for example, you see China using its economic power to try to colonize other countries and spread its geopolitical position. This, for example, has been clear in Latin America, how they make certain alliances with specific regimes and trying to strengthen their power. This is also something we see on the energy sector, specifically with Iran and China. For example, China, right now, what they do is that they have become the way for Iran and Venezuela to sell oil internationally. Basically, what they do is that they rebrand oil from the sanctioned nations, and then they sell it overseas. And just to give you an example as well, Malaysia right now has twice its exports of oil than its oil production, because Malaysia is becoming a hub for rebranding sanctioned oil into other markets. This is something, for example, I saw in Venezuela very clearly: the influence of Turkey, the influence of China, the influence of Iran, the influence of Russia. Russia has a strong presence in the Venezuelan military, and specifically in the way Venezuela controls its communication system. The way Cuba, for example, is involved in the Venezuelan military and is also involved in Venezuela's diplomatic efforts. The way, for example, Iran cooperates with Venezuela to avoid US sanctions on all sectors. So basically what we have is that the West has to realize that the same way that the authoritarians are working together, we also need to work together. Policies have to have a greater degree of synergy, especially policies such as sanctions. And at the same time, the things that people like in organization do is extremely important, because we need to be more together, the people who believe in democracy and who believe in freedom. What I see is that different freedom movements, for example, the freedom movement in Venezuela, is very isolated to, for example, the movements from Hong Kong or Zimbabwe or Iran, or even in Latin America, even with Nicaragua, for instance. And what we need to do is to establish bridges of communication between all our movements. And so this way we can actually counteract, and we can actually go on the offensive, and we can actually bring democracy to our countries. I really believe that it's a time to step up. And I really believe that the same way many people are stepping up to Ukraine, we need to do it with other nations. Ukraine is like the epicenter of this fight between democracy and autocracy. But this fight is being played right now in countries like Venezuela, in countries like Iran, in countries like Turkey. And what we have to do is to all together work so that democracy wins and it wins in every battlefield. Because today is Ukraine. But what happens if tomorrow, then we have the Iranians more involved in Venezuela? Will that bring stability to the region or to the US? No. So what we need to bring stability, to bring regional security, and to bring economic prosperity is to actually defend our democracies, protect our democracies, and protect those countries that are also very vulnerable right now, that are at a point in which they don't know if they're going to go to democracy or to autocracy. So I think we're living very important moments in history.
Oh, thank you for that, Jorge. Very interesting and good start to the conversation. Mr. Downer, your thesis.
Well, thanks, Magnus. Well, I mean, I don't really dispute what Jorge has been saying, but to understand what is happening in the world, you have to understand history. And so let's fast forward to modern history, to 1989, 1990, 1991, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of Soviet influence, and finally the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. I think there was a mindset in the West that we had, in the famous words, reached the end of history. The objective of society was to aim towards liberal democracy, that authoritarian regimes of the sort we saw in the Soviet Union and as we see in China, Iran, of course, which the theocracy came to power in 1979 with the overthrow of the Shah, that these kinds of authoritarian regimes were declining, gradually declining, and would eventually the world would, I think it was implicit really, the world would be a happy liberal democratic place with a competitive and open and free market where consumers made the decisions rather than producers and authoritarian rulers when it came to economic policy. So we just, I think in the West, assumed that we were reaching the end of, if you like, political and economic evolution. Not the end of all evolution, but the end of that kind of systemic evolution. And I think what has happened over the last 10 years or more is that we've suddenly realized that that hypothesis might not be true. And this sudden realization that the great battle between liberal democracies and authoritarian states was continuing, I think emanated a little bit from the Middle East, when we had 9/11, the so-called war, as George W. Bush called it, the war on terror, that led to the invasion of Afghanistan. We assumed getting rid of the Taliban and their mates in Al-Qaeda would be wildly popular with people in Afghanistan because they would be liberated and free. That has turned out to be not so simple. And so liberal democracies led by the United States got, reasonably bogged down in Afghanistan and just hold that thought for a minute. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, something transformational and, in my view, the single most important geopolitical development in the world was taking place, and that was the rise of China. So the rise of China as a one-party state was seen as, if you like, a process that this country, which was running quite a good and increasingly open and competitive economic policy, a country that was seeing the living standards of its people increase very rapidly, and with that a very rapidly growing middle class, that what would come out of that would be steps, maybe small steps, but steps towards liberal democracy in China itself. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and Boris Yeltsin became the president of Russia, and Russia became as we saw it in the West, a liberal democracy, part of the family of liberal democracies. I mean, there were some ups and downs there, as you'll recall, on the way through. But this was the assumption that we were making. And I think the assumptions that we were making were wrong right from the start, because what they didn't do is take into consideration sufficiently history, geography, economics, and politics, which you have to do when you ever look at a country and try to evaluate why its domestic and foreign policy is as it is. So the most important mistake that many made was the assumption that China, as it became richer, would become more liberal and more democratic. And in fact, that hasn't happened at all. So Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China began in the late 1970s, and through to the ascent of Xi Jinping, the current president of China, which was in 2012. It is true there had not just been an economic miracle, but the country had opened up much more. It had become more liberal. It had become more tolerant. As it got richer for a while, it became more engaged with the world and more collaborative. But since Xi Jinping has come to power, he has really reinforced some of the historic traditions of Chinese authoritarianism. I mean, there are reasons for this, and we haven't got time to go into all of that. There are reasons for why China is as it is, and they are born out of its history. But he has decided that as China becomes more powerful, it shouldn't be subjected to pressure from liberal democracies. It shouldn't allow liberal democracies to interfere in its internal affairs, which are broadly defined, because that includes Taiwan. And indeed, it shouldn't allow the liberal democracies led by America and Britain to determine the way the world works and the architecture of the world, not anymore. So the more powerful China has become, the richer it has become, the more it has been able to spend on its defense force, the more it has been able to spend on R&D and technological developments, the more it has been able to invest in other parts of the world through China Inc., the more it has been able itself to interfere with the structures of other countries, the more as they see it, they can weaken the liberal democratic paradigm and the liberal democratic hold on the international community. And then it's really important to understand that, because the liberal democratic model was established in the mid 1940s as the Second World War came to an end, and after the Second World War. And it included multilateral institutions, not many of them, of course, but above all, the United Nations. It included what's nowadays called the World Trade Organization, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and a series of other institutions which reinforced notions of universal human rights, international collaboration, resolution of conflict through peaceful and negotiated means, not through the use of force, and the concept of that the most powerful will respect the less powerful. So within the United Nations General Assembly, there is the notion of all countries being equal, not in the Security Council, of course, but in the General Assembly. So, in the General Assembly, the United States vote is worth the same as Samoa's. So these concepts, and in particular, I want to emphasize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, fair enough, was written in America as the Second World War came to an end. These notions have been challenged and increasingly challenged by China. I think less so by Russia, and when it comes to Iran, the other authoritarian state that I would look at here pretty much just disregarded. Though all of these countries participate in their multilateral architecture, but what they want to do ultimately is give themselves more space to promote their national interests as they judge them, and they see it in a binary way. They see it as what is good for them will be bad for America and its allies, and what is good for the free world is bad for them. They don't see any particular marrying between the two, which is hard to understand, I suppose, but that's how they think. So having made that analysis, let's think about where this goes. I actually think this was looking really bad for the West when President Biden made his catastrophic mistake to withdraw, as he did early last year, from Afghanistan. It made the West, in particular America, but America and its allies, look pitifully weak. They looked divided, America divided because of this Trump versus anti-Trump sort of debate within America. The West looked uncoordinated, the West looked incoherent, and the West looked as though it was losing its passion for its philosophical underpinnings in liberal democratic values and the liberal market economics. It looked as though it was losing faith in that. And I personally at the time thought the withdrawal from Afghanistan sent a terrible message to the authoritarian world, which wants to weaken the rules-based international system and the liberal democratic paradigm, to put it simply. And so I think what happened then was people like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and others thought they could take advantage of this weakness of the West. So in the case of China, they became increasingly have been aggressive for quite some time, but increasingly aggressive in the South China Sea, militarizing reefs there, which are not part of Chinese sovereignty according to the United Nations, disregarding that, using force in order to assert themselves in the Indo-Pacific region, and very brutally using money diplomacy to essentially try to buy the affection and support of other countries, particularly weaker countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And for Russia, you know, they first of all, you know, there was the war in Georgia. There was in 2014, Russia just took over Crimea from Ukraine, just seized it, and parts of the Donbass. And, you know, everyone was very cross about it, but nothing was really done because, you know, the West is divided and feckless. So with that background, then Afghanistan happened. And I think particularly what you saw then was an increasing, not an alliance, but a sense of collaboration between China and Russia. I mean, they don't have a love affair, these two. It is a relationship of convenience, but they did see that they were making common cause. So I think this year, as we grow, we come close towards the end of this year has been another pivotal year. It has been a pivotal year for the, let me just explain, and in a good sense, not in a bad sense. Back in February, early February, at the opening of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had their historic meeting and made their historic agreement that they were going to be partners forever and on all issues, and that there would be no differences between them. I don't know what transpired in those discussions, and nobody does know, between the Russians and the Chinese about what Russia was going to do in Ukraine. But already the Western intelligence agencies, particularly the American and British intelligence agencies, were filling the media with stories about how Russia was going to invade. And obviously the Chinese would have been aware of these media stories. They may have assumed that Russia would be able to take over Ukraine in a matter of days and it wouldn't be a problem because of the mighty Russian military. And then the invasion happened, and then the West reacted. And what has been transformative is the way the West reacted. So Putin, I don't think, estimated that this would happen, but the West quickly came together with a sense of great unity in introducing sanctions. I know Jorge was just pointing out there's been some sanctions busting, of course. There always is when you have sanctions, don't you worry. But the sanctions were pretty tough. And of course, these sanctions are not so much oil and the like, energy, the sanctions that really hurt our financial sanctions. And when, you know, Russia can't use the SWIFT system and so on, has difficulty conducting financial transactions, that takes a while to hurt. But in time, that becomes excruciatingly painful, that kind of sanction. You can't really participate in the mainstream of the global economy. That limits your scope. So the Russians probably thought, we've got this relationship with China and that's going to be all right. But the West united in their horror at what Putin did in Ukraine, more than the Russians and the Chinese would have estimated. And the decision by the West, not just to support each other, but to pour resources, military resources into Ukraine to help the Ukrainians fight this war, and in particular to provide the Ukrainians with very sophisticated, very accurate, very targeted precision weapons, and also to help the Ukrainians develop military tactics to deal with an assault of this kind. That has shocked Russia, and I think much more importantly than shocking Russia, that has shocked China. China didn't think that would happen. And the failure of Russia in Ukraine has, I think, had a cathartic effect in Beijing, that the Chinese regime is starting to think, we need to be a bit more cautious in how we deal with these liberal democracies and countries aligned with the liberal democracies. So where does this all lead? This leads to us finally learning the lesson that these authoritarians, so first of all, we were wrong to think that our liberal democratic freedom-loving system would continue to spread through the world and that would be the end of world history. We now know that's not true. We now know there are other people with other ideologies, with authoritarian leaders who are often quite popular in their own countries, who not just reject our system, but reject the rules-based international system. And these people want to weaken that international rules-based system, of course, and to weaken us. And they thought they could. And what has now happened is that we've come together in response to Ukraine, and we have, I mean, if you like, here is a phrase which was used in 1941 by the Japanese Admiral Yamamoto at the time of Pearl Harbor. He wasn't so sure that this Pearl Harbor attack was a great idea. As he said at that time, we have awoken a sleeping lion. And I think that's what Putin has done. He has awoken a sleeping lion. The unity there is across the aisle in the United States, the relative unity there has been in Europe, the support that has come from countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, and even a great old ally of Russia's, India, has started to walk a bit away from Russia over what it's done in Ukraine. Very cautious in what they've said about it, but they haven't been very flattering about it. I think this has led to a much more positive determination by the liberal democratic West to stand up to authoritarian regimes. So, I mean, I don't think there's any need to be pessimistic, but it's really important. It's really important that the liberal democracies, the major liberal democracies, hang together, as they say, or they'll hang separately. That they hang together and learn from the complacency, would be the right word to use, the complacency of that period post 1991, collapse of the Soviet Union up until the invasion of Ukraine. So Xi Jinping, I think, would be very hesitant about invading Taiwan now. But 2 years ago, he probably thought he would, was not sure, but he thought he might be able to get away with it. That's how I think the world has changed. And we need, you know, in America needs to be always in the lead here, but we need to make sure that these authoritarian leaders know that there is no long-term future in their attempts to spread authoritarianism. So that, I hope, gives you a bit of a sense of where I come from. I believe in freedom.
Thank you very much, Mr. Danner. Very well summed up where you come from. I'd just like to point out to the participants that the questions that you can send in are in the Q&A section, and I will tackle them closing to the end of our panel. One question that I would just like to start off with is probably recent developments in China. This question is for both of you. Maybe Jorge can speak from the Latin American perspective in this, or the North American one. But Danner is, of course, closer to the region with his experience. The Chinese Communist Party just had their Congress. Xi Jinping extended his term by, if I'm not mistaken, by 5 more years, and exchanged the Central Committee with all of his close advisors. Can it be expected that there will be a change in Chinese foreign policy since Xi has consolidated his forces inside the country?
Well, so I don't think there's going to be. It won't work like that. There won't suddenly be a change in their objectives and their foreign policy, but there will be a change in tactics. I think their strategy will continue to be what it has been. That is, it take a long time to describe their strategy, but basically to give themselves more space, become the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific region. And ultimately, they would like to see American influence, if not disappear, substantially diminish in the Indo-Pacific region. I often say for China, they have a kind of Monroe doctrine for the Indo-Pacific. They regard it as their sphere of influence, and America, Japan, Australia, and to some extent India, these countries are proving irritatingly resistant. So they have tried to shout these countries down. They have been abusive. They introduced sanctions against Australia, refusing to buy some products from Australia. They use economic leverage. They spy. They interfere with domestic politics in these countries, all sorts of mechanisms they use. And they're finding these are not working. And what they are doing is they're uniting these countries against China, and they're increasingly isolating themselves. And I think they have worked this out. So their strategic objectives may remain the same. They're not suddenly going to turn around and say, we're going to join Australia, Japan, the United States, and India in our determination to make the Indo-Pacific region a region of peace and freedom. But I don't think are going to confront them as aggressively as they have in the past, because they're seeing the price that they will pay for that. They have also been quite struck by the huge price Russia is gradually paying. I don't mean here militarily, I mean in terms of the sanctions. So already for China, the United States is not selling chips to China anymore. And this is a huge setback for their AI industries and their technological ambitions. So they're seeing all this resistance coming from the West. They are pretty dependent on the West. And all this resistance coming from the West is going to be increasingly problematic. So note that a lot of their language, anti-Western language, has been toned down. The wolf warrior aggression of their ambassadors has suddenly come to an end. So I think they have realized this strategy they had, the tactics they were using have not been really very successful. And in fact, I think China's foreign policy over the last few years, last 5 or 6 years, has been one of the most disastrous exercises in foreign policy I've seen any country conduct.
Well, I mean, I believe the same, in the sense that the strategy of the Chinese will be the same moving forward, because it's paying off. I think what we need to see is the changes that the West should do in terms of foreign policy, or specifically the change that the US should do in terms of foreign policy. And the same way that Alexander was talking about China's interest on, controlling its region. To me, as Venezuelan, it's astonishing when I see foreign policy reports from the State Department, how little attention it goes to the Latin American countries, how little attention it goes to its natural sphere of influence, to its natural ally. Because if the United States would focus on Latin America, on really building a Pan-American kind of alliance in the region, its most important issues could be fixed. For example, if we see the economic issue, Latin America that is more developed, that has higher rates of economic growth, will benefit American companies the most. Same way with the supply chain issues. If you see, for example, the migration issue, which Americans consider a big issue, if you consider, for example, the drug trafficking issue, all these problems are problems that could be solved if the United States had a good policy towards Latin America, a policy that tries to foster democracy, stability, and economic development. So in that case, I think that's the major shift that the US should do in the short term. I will agree also that the fact that Ukraine will win will change the next generation, in the sense that it will revitalize the West. It will give a sense of strength to the West. And yes, it will tell dictators everywhere that these kind of things, this kind of move cannot happen. Because we cannot return to 100 years ago when countries could annex territory. I think what we saw in Ukraine and where we're seeing Ukraine now is the results of the mistakes of 2014, for instance, or the mistakes of not bringing NATO to Ukraine sooner. So in that sense, I think I'm also positive and also optimistic. And also, I want to emphasize something. The West is doing enough and a lot for Ukraine. But ultimately, the Ukrainian people and their willingness to fight for freedom and their willingness to defend their sovereignty, they are the real heroes. When I talk to them, and a few of them I see are on this call, I see brave people. I see people that defend the values that we believe. They want to defend their country because of their civic sense of duty. And I think that's something that I really admire. And those are the spirit that many people in the West have forgotten. That democracy is not about security. Democracy is not about protecting your benefits or protecting your welfare. Democracy is a set of ideas. Freedom is a set of ideas that we all believe. Freedom of speech, freedom of commerce, the rule of law, and the possibility to elect our leaders and to decide our future. And I think when I see the Ukrainians and I talk to the Ukrainians, I see people, brave people, people that understand the meaning of freedom, which when I talk to people in the West, sometimes they forget. Because it's normal when you live in a good society, when you live in a safe society, to forget that the question, and coming back to the question of authoritarianism, the question is not why there are authoritarian nations. The question is why there are liberal democracies. Authoritarianism, dictatorship, tyranny has been the norm in our history. And again, coming back to the history question that Alexander pointed out, what we need to study is why then some societies took the rational decision to tell themselves, we're going to build institutions based on the will of the people. We're going to build institutions based on protecting minorities, and we're going to live in peace. And I think this is the exception. And I think this is why the 1990s narrative that democracy will come automatically is completely mistaken. Because democracy is an exception. Democracy is something that we have to build with our rationality. Because the structures of society, I think, are moving towards something very different. Alexander also pointed out to the fact of geography or history. When I see, for example, my own country, Venezuela, everything is against us in terms of democracy, in the sense that if you study oil, all oil-rich nations, we all have problems with democracy because the structure for economies tends to be so concentrated on a few hands on the state. It tends to give so much money to a few people. It also prevents the right political economy for democracies to flourish, in the sense that the states, for example, are not funded by taxations, but rather by revenues from oil, in the sense that the states do not have incentives to provide public goods, because again, its revenues come from selling oil to foreign countries. So in that sense, we have structural tendencies that tend towards authoritarianism. In terms of geography, in the Ukrainian case, is very evident. There are some countries that are prisoners of their geography: Ukraine, Poland, Afghanistan. But then the only way to revert this is with people that are rationally thinking about having a different kind of society and defending that society every single day against those that will push towards a different future. And I think this is why, again, what is going on in Ukraine was a wake-up call. And in the future, I think we also need to prevent these things from happening. For years, for example, in Venezuela, we said that the Iranians were controlling more and more of our energy sector, that the Russians were controlling more and more of our military, that drug dealers, that guerrilla groups were entering into the territory. And the international community simply did not look at all until the problem was too big. And now we have 7 million refugees in Colombia, in other places in Latin America, some in Europe, and some in the US. But the international community tends to focus on a problem when it's too late. And this is a change that we have to do and prevent future disasters. So I think these kind of conversations is what we actually have to do so we can prevent exactly that.
Thank you, Jorge. A question here from the audience, from an anonymous attendee. We're going a little bit outside here. This anonymous attendee asked the question, why the world is never talking about the genocide taking place in the Republic Democratic of the Congo. So I just wanted to, we'll stop here for a short while. Just if we talk about the international narrative of what's going on in the world, it seems what this attendee is trying to ask the questions, it kind of falls down.
Well, I think it depends what you mean by the world is talking about. That is an expression that usually means the media is talking about what the media is interested in. So the media is dominated by the West. That's where all the money is in the media. And we're not aware all the money is, but where an awful lot of the money is. And there are parts of the world that they're more interested in than others. for what it's worth. So the media focus on Europe. If something goes wrong in Europe, they get very excited about that. So what's happened in Ukraine is of great interest. What happens in Africa, much less so. So civil war in Ethiopia, human rights abuses in Democratic Republic of Congo, the collapse of Zimbabwe. There is, what's happening in Zimbabwe today. Nobody knows because the media just don't. Almost no one knows, but because the media don't cover it. The media are interested in North Korea. They're not interested in the DRC. Now I've said all that, but that doesn't mean that people who are decision makers are not interested. I mean, after all, there's a substantial, might not be a very good one, but there's a substantial UN peacekeeping force in Congo. That means Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions have passed, which have created that peacekeeping force. So efforts are being made by the international community to try to rectify the situation there. What I'm saying is that diplomats are often working very hard on issues which just don't generate any real interest in the media. And so that perhaps goes to the heart of that question from your anonymous questioner. I wouldn't, if I were him or her, my advice would be don't despair, because decision makers do know about the problems in Congo. They do know about them, and they do know a lot of people are getting killed there. And they have been trying to do something about it. I mean, why it's happened and how difficult it is to resolve, that's another question for another time. But I'm on the board of something called the International Crisis Group, and it's a think tank really, based in Brussels and Washington DC, and it produces a lot of reports on bloodshed and conflict in Africa, including Congo. So I wouldn't despair. A lot of thought is being given to it. It's just not in the media.
Thank you very much, Mr. Downer. Jorge, I think Mr. Downer managed to sum up the answer to this question very well and eloquently, so I'm going to allow you to lead for the next question here. Movin Omundi asks here, from your analysis, this is for both panelists, Jorge, you will start off the bat. From your analysis, how long is the Ukraine war going to last? And what do you think would be the highlight in terms of impact on the future of democracy is concerned? Do you think Russia would be willing to relinquish the regions it lays claim on as part of a peace treaty at the end? It's basically a very big open-ended question. How are things going to go? Gentlemen, please predict the future.
Yes, I mean, nobody can predict the future, but this war will last as long as Putin surrenders. Putin has to understand that it's a lost war for its nation. And basically, wars tend to end in history for two reasons. Either one side wins by a lot, or there is a stalemate on the battlefield. Basically, there's no other way. The Ukrainians want to win. They need to win. They will win the battlefield. And then eventually diplomacy will catch up to that reality. There's no other way, because Russia is not interested in any kind of peace treaty because they are the aggressors. So that's what I will say. How many weeks? How many months? I don't know, and I don't trust anybody who says that knows that answer. And how it will define the future of democracy, we have talked about it before. It will define everything, because I believe it's the epicenter of this battle and this tension. And this is why, again, the West has to keep supporting And if you ask me, what is the best way to finish this war, is to give full support to Ukraine, not tomorrow, now. Full military support, full economic support, full diplomatic support now, so that the balance of power goes to the Ukrainian people, and then we can finish this war. The sooner, the better. There is no other way.
Yeah, well, how long will it last? As Jorge says, you don't know, but it will last a while, because I don't see President Putin giving in or giving up, despite the setbacks that they have suffered. The Russians have suffered militarily, and I don't see President Zelensky coming to the view that, well, you know, we've stopped them invading Kiev and taking most of the country, but we have to just accept that we've lost Crimea and much of the Donbass, and so we should just sign an agreement with them, making over part of our country to Russia. I can't see that happening. So I expect this war will go on for quite some time. It will become something of what you might call a frozen conflict. I think that it has the potential to end up as a bit of a stalemate. But we'll have to wait and see. But the Ukrainians have been doing very well, and the West, particularly the Americans, but the Europeans, the British, and the other Europeans need to, and my own country, Australia, we all need to continue to provide very substantial support to the Ukrainians who, it's true, they have been very brave, because an awful lot of them have been killed. When we focus on the something like 35,000 Russian soldiers who have been killed, and something like 40,000 to 50,000 have been wounded. But we don't focus on the Ukrainian casualties, but they would be huge as well. So this is a very bloody war. So the sooner it comes to an end, the better. And you know, my whole hypothesis when it comes to the liberal democracies is that they've demonstrated that if you push them too far, particularly if a major power pushes them too far, then they will resist. And you know, the military, it's not just the diplomatic support and the sanctions, but it's the military support that has been given to the Ukrainians and the training that has been done for the Ukrainian armed forces. That has been a very clear demonstration of the West, you know, just waking up really. So no doubt Taiwan will get better access to military equipment than it's had before. It's had good access, but they get still better access to high-end military equipment, sophisticated technologies.
Very well done. Thank you, Mr. Downer. Thank you, Mr. Jorge. The last question of the day that we'll tackle, it seems you each get 2 minutes to talk about this one. Jorge, you start off, is from a question from John Mugabe. To what extent has the long stay in power affecting the new rise of authoritarianism in the world? This is a very interesting question. It's talking about how the long stay in power of national leaders. Now, Xi is extending his term. Putin has been in power since I was born almost. Do you think this is helping solidify totalitarian policies inside the country, inside these authoritarian countries?
Basically, when countries do not have mechanism for transitions of power. And yes, this happens, and this is a problem. This is a big problem. And we see that, for example, we have the same tendency in Latin America, is that leaders tend to become very, ingrained in power. And then their policies then become much more radicalized, because in the sense that because they want to tighten their grip on power, basically, for example, the quality of their ministers decrease, the quality of the policies decrease, and also the political calculation decrease. So we see that in Latin America. And yes, I will agree that this is a tendency that authoritarian nations have.
Mr. Downer.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. This isn't the reason they're able to remain in power is that they have, in particular, the support of the military and the police, and they don't have to worry about elections. I mean, I'm speaking to you from London. So yesterday they swore in their third prime minister in 6 weeks. So these people, so it sounds like a bad thing, but in a sense it's not a bad thing, that if a prime minister starts to fail, there are mechanisms to get rid of them. And in my own country of Australia, we've had exactly the same thing. We have had prime ministers like John Howard and Robert Menzies, who have remained in power for many years. But every 3 years in Australia and every 5 years here in the UK, they have to run the gauntlet of an election. And you know, you have a free press, and people are able to run candidates and make arguments against the government. They're subject to endless scrutiny. That is one big difference too with between liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes. I mean, there's just a litany of complaints from the media day in and day out about the government in a democracy. Shocking, they're not doing enough on the health service. There's some breakdown in a hospital. Ambulances are queuing outside of hospitals. The patients can't get in. I mean, these sorts of things, there's constant debate about it. Well, this doesn't make the leaders popular because there are always complaints, no matter who the government is. And it means they have to be on their toes the whole time, responding to and in particular, not responding to the media too much is bad politics, responding to the public and public concerns and public needs, they have to. Whereas in an authoritarian state, there is no criticism. I mean, people might be sitting in a bar privately criticizing the leader, but not many would have the guts to do that because somebody might dob them in and end up in jail. But I mean, the media doesn't scrutinize the leaders. There aren't complaints and criticisms. I mean, this is one of the weaknesses of these societies. I mean, if you want to know why China has done incredibly well, because it has liberalized since 1979, and now it's deliberalizing and becoming increasingly authoritarian. It's not doing so well. Russia, look at the living standards of the average Russian and compare them with, you know, a country like Germany, which has been reduced to ruins twice in the first half of the 20th century. But look at the living standards of people living in, you know, in Frankfurt and Stuttgart, and compare them to St. Petersburg and Moscow. I mean, you know, it says it all, frankly. It's just, I mean, in Latin America, I mean, what the hell's the matter with Latin America? All the resources that they have, you know, lots of people and beautiful countryside, but look at the living standards, the per capita GDP of people in Latin America compared to North America or Australia or Japan or Europe, UK. I mean, you know, it's what happens if you don't have proper debate and scrutiny and transparency in government and proper elections and so on. I mean, I know democracy is untidy and it's messy. It is messy. It is untidy. But honestly, it delivers good results for the people.
It does. It does. Thank you very much, Mr. Downer, and thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you for allowing me to moderate this session. We're 2 minutes over time right now. And I would like to say thank you for the attendees for attending and watching this, and I hope you all learned something. I recommend you check the alumni website, check the alumni programs and the next sessions of the alumni and dialogues, and the government school at King's College, where Mr. Downer is executive chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magnus. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you very much indeed.
Recording stopped.